I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get into the slideshow here. Hopefully you're all seeing that. And hopefully now you're seeing the slides. So as it says here, greetings from the Newberry Library. As George said, I'm Will Hansen. I'm Director of Reader Services and Curator of Americana at the Newberry in Chicago, in the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago. Talking with you about the postcard collections there, in particularly the Curt Teich collection, and then the other postcard collections we also have at the Newberry. You are seeing on the screen here an example of one of the Curt Teich company's postcards, and much more about that in a minute. Here's another example of a Curt Teich postcard of the Newberry Library. So normally I would say I'm coming to you from this building. I'm not doing that tonight. I'm doing that from home. But this is the Newberry Library, if you're not familiar with it, on a postcard from, I think, the 1940s. To just lay the groundwork here for those who aren't familiar, what the Newberry is and does. The Newberry Library is an independent research library focused on the humanities. We were founded in 1887 by a bequest from early Chicago settler and businessman named Walter Newberry. Sometimes people think the Newberry Medal that the children's book is awarded for every year is affiliated with the Newberry Library. It's not, actually. It's a different Newberry. But we, like I said, have been in existence for over 130 years. We've been in the building that you see on the screen here since 1893. And we are open to you. We're free and open to the public. If you're interested in the collection you hear about tonight or anything else that the Newberry has, you're welcome to come in. As long as you're 14 years old or older, you can use the collections in the reading rooms. Our exhibitions are open to everyone, regardless of age. And our reference services are open to everyone, regardless of age. So we always welcome questions, even if you can't make it into the reading room. And you're always welcome to use our digital collections that I'll talk a little bit more about as well. All of which is to say that we have much more than postcards, although we're very proud of our postcard collections. We collect in the humanities, so history, literature, art, music, religion, other kinds of performing arts, in a variety of disciplines. That is still a huge range to cover, so we collect more deeply in the areas you see on the screen here. We collect rare books, manuscripts, other kinds of archival materials, ephemera, and postcards are a textbook example of a kind of ephemera, material that wasn't made to last, but that can teach us a lot about history nevertheless. And other kinds of primary sources, as well as the secondary sources to help interpret those primary sources from history. In the topics you see here, postcards are the newest addition to the collecting areas that we focus on most strongly at the Newberry. The postcard collections were really established at the Newberry in 2016, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But you can probably see from this list that postcards fit very well with our existing collecting areas. We're very well known for our history of printing and history of the book collections. Postcards are very important in the history of printing and printing technologies and arts. We're also very well known for our American history and culture collections, our collections related to US history, particularly in the colonial and early Republic periods. But into the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries as well. We're very well known for our Indigenous studies collections, and there's a lot of interesting material in postcards related to Indigenous peoples of the United States and Canada as well. And we're very well known for our genealogy and local history collections. We're typically thought of as one of the best half dozen or so libraries in the country for doing family history and other kinds of local history research. And postcards have a lot to tell us about those kinds of histories as well. Along with the other topics here as well. Our map collection is very well known. We have something like 600,000 maps in our building and other materials related to exploration. There's something like 1.5 million books in our collection, millions of items in our manuscript collections, over 1,000 separate manuscript collections are in the building, as well as far as we can tell, the largest institutional postcard collection in the country, if not the world. Our postcard collection includes around over 2 million items and over 500,000 unique images. There are duplicate items within that for reasons that I'll talk about in a little bit. So greetings from Chicago. As I already mentioned, the most famous part of our postcard collections is the archive of the Curt Teich Company. And you're seeing one of the most famous examples of their postcards on the screen here. Curt Teich is probably best known as the producers of what are known as large letter postcards. So postcards like this, where you have greetings from, and then a city with images from that city embedded in each of the letters of its name on a very colorful background, typically. And they produced these for cities and towns all over the country and also in Canada and other international countries. And did not create them. There were other examples of these before the Curt Teich Company got into making them, but they sort of perfected them, I guess I would say, and became very well known for them. So this is one example of their work from Chicago. They're also very well known for scenes like this, views of main streets from around the country, in this case, a view from Cedar Falls, Iowa, in 1943. They documented a lot of small towns in postcards that other postcard producers had not, and had a large crew of traveling salesmen going around and commissioning orders from drugstores and other businesses in these towns to create postcards for them. So the collection really creates it forms an amazing visual archive of the United States and beyond in the 20th century for those reasons. Curt Teich produced well over 400,000 different postcards, images on postcards from the 1890s to the 1970s. And it's an amazing resource for learning about American visual culture and material culture in the 20th century. Where do postcards come from? Maybe I should say a little bit about the history of postcards before we go in too deep here. Postcards don't start from scratch. It wasn't somebody's unique idea to create the thing that we know as the picture postcard that became one of the most common, ubiquitous, widely distributed forms of media in the 20th century. It came about from a sort of combination of things. The picture postcard that we know combines correspondence. Typically, it's somebody writing to somebody else, although postcards have also been collected as on their own as collector's items really since the very start. It's a piece of mail, so it's sent through a postal system and requires postal systems to send it. Although, again, many of them have not been sent and have been collected instead as collector's items. And it's imagery. It's typically a visual image. And those three things came together to create what we know of as the picture postcard in the second half of the 19th century. The precursors to it, the things that sort of led up to postcards being created, are a few different things. One example of which is shown here. Envelopes that included imagery started popping up in the US in the 1850s and particularly the 1860s during the Civil War, the US Civil War. It became popular to send your correspondence in an envelope with a visual image on it that supported the war effort, particularly on the Union side. So you can see an envelope here supporting the Union effort in the Civil War. And we have a large collection of these, what are called in sort of collecting circles, patriotic covers or patriotic envelopes at the Newberry as well. And this is a sort of precursor. It was just an envelope with an image on it that you would just write the address on to send your correspondence. Another example here that was actually sent to a member of the Newberry family from another member who was serving in the Union Army. And in this case, it's an image of General George Washington, a historic figure on his horse on a sort of platform supporting the Union effort as well. So that's the sort of start of combining correspondence and image and mail. By the 1870s and 80s, the US Postal Service starts authorizing the use of postal cards. Sort of became shortened over the years to postcard, but at this time they were still called postal cards. And they did not really include much imagery at all The reason for which is that postal regulations required that one side be kept just for the address. You just write the address on one side, and the other side was to write your message, what you actually wanted to tell the person you were sending the correspondence to. So generally they had no imagery or very little imagery. In the case of the card here, where you can see there's a little image of U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, General and then President Grant, in the upper right corner, where we would think of putting a stamp. At this time, you didn't have to put a stamp on postcards. They sort of came sold with the postage already included. So postal cards start being used then. They had actually been invented earlier in Europe, in the sort of German-speaking countries, in particular Austria, Germany, and others, and became very popular immediately. Millions of them were already getting circulated through the mail in Europe by the 1860s and 70s, by the time that the US Postal Service authorized the use of these cards here. The imagery still wasn't there, though, until really the 1890s. And a combination of printing technologies and being able to inexpensively produce imagery at this scale, with sort of loosening postal regulations around the use of imagery on postcards, combined to allow postcards as we now know them to take shape. So here you have a very early example of what we would think of as closer to a picture postcard now. At this time, it's still the case that you have to have address on one side, the text of the message on the other. But in the case of the card you're seeing here from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the picture is basically taking over one side of the card, and there's only a little space to leave a message. Postal regulations would loosen up even further, and the post office would authorize having the address and a message on one side, so that the entire back or front, depending on how you're looking at it, would then be free for an image. And the imagery is what really captured people's imagination and made postcards such collectible items in the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s in particular. But World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago is one of the first places where postcards like this became popular and were widely distributed. Moving on a little bit to the Curt Teich Company, which, as I said, is the sort of foundation of the Newberry's collections of postcards. Curt Teich Company was a Chicago business. They were founded in 1898 in Chicago by German immigrants. Curt Teich, who you're seeing in the photos here from the Teich family papers, which are also at the Newberry. He emigrated from Germany to Chicago in 1895 when he was 18. So basically, as he came of age, he emigrated to the US. He was trained as a printer, which was the family business of the Teichs in Lobenstein in Germany. As I said, in 1898, so a few years after he came to the US, he established a printing business with his brother Max. Max wasn't really involved with the business. He basically just was a silent partner. Curt Teich really ran the business. And at first, they mostly just did what's called job printing. They would print business cards. They would print newspapers or magazines. Basically, you could come in and say, I want this printed, and they would print it for you, usually pretty quick jobs. But he had good training in Germany. Germany was really the center of color printing in particular in the world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And he took a trip back to Germany in 1904 that really opened his eyes to modern postcard printing processes. He hadn't really been involved in postcard printing prior to that, but when he saw what they were able to do, producing large numbers of postcards that looked really beautiful with really eye-popping color in 1904, he decided to get into the business. So he famously came back to the US, and the story is that he took a train around the country, basically selling the idea of picture postcards, selling people on this new idea that people would be interested in buying postcards that included an image of their hometown or of a building in their hometown or of some other sort of tourist attraction or any other kind of imagery that they could order from him. and he would produce them and they could sell them, typically for a penny, which was still the going rate for postcards at a time. The idea took off. He returned from that trip with over $30,000 in orders, and the business took off. The Teich company was successful in part because of Teich's training combined with the innovative printing techniques he had found in Germany. They were headquartered in this factory on Irving Park Boulevard in Chicago. So if you know Chicago, it's on the north side, corner of Irving Park and Ravenswood, basically, in Chicago. And the building still exists, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But they were pioneers in color postcard printing on an offset press, which is technical jargon that I won't go into too much, although if anybody wants to talk about it, I can a little bit more. By 1909, they were doing enough business that Teich was able to commission the creation of a very large offset press, large enough to produce 32 postcards per sheet of paper, and do them really quickly so that they could really produce a huge number of postcards each day. The pioneering in these color printing processes allowed them to create images that were sharper and clearer and at a faster and higher output. So the Teich company could both produce sort of better looking postcards as well as creating them faster and producing more content that would make their customers happy and get the product to them more quickly. So they were successful for all of these reasons as well as others. So the factory is shown there. Here's a couple of images from the Teich company's archives of the business in operation. So you can see some of these very large offset presses working away in the image on the left. The Irving Park Road location that I showed on the previous slide, they moved into in 1911. So that was when they were really expanding and the business was booming. And they even expanded to another building in 1922. During the height of the company's operations in the 20s, 30s, and 40s is when they produced the most postcards. And at one time, the Curt Teich company was the biggest postcard producer in the world. And they remained one of the biggest postcard producers in the world throughout most of the 20th century, literally producing billions of postcards with a B. It's sort of staggering the number of postcards that circulated and the number of postcards that the Teich company produced. But during the height of their operation, they were working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, keeping those presses running. The fifth floor of one of the buildings contained the company's archives, which is most of what's now at the Newberry, including file copies of all of the postcards that they produced. They had an advertising department. They had a reception area and mail room. The fourth floor below that was dedicated to photography with their cameras and the overall press, the overall operation of converting photographs into postcards. The art department, which you see in the image on the right, was also there, and you can see dozens of people working there on the process of converting original photographs into reproducible postcards, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. They had up to 30 presses operating at once, and they operated simultaneously at some times at the peak periods of production. They took paper from the first floor and raised it by elevator up to the press, fed the paper through the press, and then lowered it back down in the elevator to the first floor where they could cut them and then ship them to their customers. So it was a really sophisticated and hardworking operation for most of the 20th century. By the mid 20th century, the Teich company really dominated the market for postcards, certainly in the US and internationally as well. They had a lot of business. An interesting part of the Teich company's operations, I think I skip ahead a little bit here. An interesting part of their operations is that they didn't just produce postcards. They always did some printing of other things as well. And probably the most interesting sidelight along those lines is that the company also produced the invasion maps that were used by the armed forces during World War II. This was a sort of secret commission from the Army Map Service to print the maps that were used in D-Day and other operations of landing in the European theater of operations in particular. So you're seeing one example of that on the left. It's not a very good image, but you maybe can make out at the top of the image that says top secret bigot. Bigot was the code word for the highest level of classification. So this was something that really was not supposed to get into the enemy's hands or anybody's hands who didn't need to see it, because they were invasion maps. They were spelling out how they were actually going to land on European soil. Teich Company produced all these maps. They produced over 3 million maps for the war effort, and you're seeing the sort of commendation that they received from the Army Map Service on the right here, acknowledging their work. They had to keep this work secret, of course, because the United States and the Allied forces overall did not want it known where these maps were being produced, or it might become a target for bombing. So they needed to keep it secret if at all possible. And the Teich Company did a very good job of doing that to the extent possible. So that's an interesting sort of sidelight to their work. I will show a little more about what they produced. Teich Company produced all kinds of postcards for all different kinds of customers. So lots of different postcards advertising different products and businesses. I am fond of this one from Bloomington, Illinois, showing an early automobile in 1917. It's actually advertising the overalls that the mechanics here are wearing in business in Bloomington, Illinois. They became very well known for their linen postcards. And this is an example of those. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. They also became very well known for the quality of the imagery that they included on their postcards, and the sort of exquisite color that popped from the postcards for reasons I'll talk about in a second. They also produced later on in the 20th century lots of postcards for very well-known businesses, McDonald's, and one of their biggest clients was actually Holiday Inn. So we sort of joke at the Newberry about how many postcards of Holiday Inns around the country we have, because literally every Holiday Inn in the country had a postcard made of it. So if you're looking for a particular image of a Holiday Inn in the 1960s or 70s, we've got it at the Newberry. It was just one of their biggest clients. So they produced postcards for all of them as the business was sort of winding down. By 1978, the company really stopped producing postcards. Postcards, the business had sort of shrunk from the 50s through the 70s. And they stopped production in 1978. The building that I showed earlier on Irving Park Road was actually converted to lofts many years later. So this is what it looks like now. So you can still visit it. It's called Postcard Place. They still have the C and the T above the doorways, so you can sort of see that it really was the Teich factory, but it's now condominiums. The reason that we have the material that we have at the Newberry is thanks to Ralph Teich, who was Curt's youngest son, who looked to save the company records. When the company went out of business, the records were basically all still in the building, and they needed to be moved because otherwise they were just going to get destroyed. They were going to get thrown out. He approached the Lake County Forest Preserve. Sorry, I thought I had an image of that here, but I don't. He approached the Lake County Forest Preserve and Historical Museum, what's now known as the Lake County Discovery Museum, about taking this material on. And thankfully, the folks at the museum did. They took the records in 1982, organized them, held them for over 40 years. They went through a process of thinking about their mission and thinking about whether the postcard collections really fit that mission, because it's an enormous collection. It's a huge collection. and decided that they thought they should transfer them to another institution, went through a process of considering bids from a variety of institutions and accepted the Newberry's bid in 2016. So that's when the collection came to the Newberry. Back a little bit to the kinds of postcards. Curt Teich Company's main innovation, one of the things the Curt Teich Company was best known for were its linen postcards. The linen postcards are not actually made on linen. They're not made on any different cardstock than other postcards. They're called linens because they used embossing roller to create a sort of linen texture. Hopefully you can kind of see that on the postcard here. And if you've ever handled postcards from the mid-20th century, you probably know what I'm talking about. They have the sort of finish that the linen cloth does, this sort of texture to them. This kind of texture allowed them to use these newer, brighter, water-soluble inks that would not actually stick to the cardstock they were used to using. And again, this innovation really kept the Teich Company at the height of the postcard market through the first half of the 20th century. The technology was developed during the Great Depression, so in the 1930s, when the country really needed colorful, optimistic, vibrant imagery and craved that kind of imagery at a pretty dark time in a lot of people's lives. So they were wildly popular. You're seeing an image here of Hollywood image, something else that was very popular in the 1930s, of Bing Crosby at home in California, as depicted on a postcard. By the 50s, they had fallen a little behind. What became known as chrome postcards sort of took over. Another example of a linen postcard here. Linen postcards also became known for their sort of modernistic imagery. They have the look of modernism in the US. So you think of those sleek buildings, some Art Deco buildings and other kinds of modernistic kind of buildings in the US. Postcards were part of that same trend of sort of sleek imagery. And the Teich Company partook from that. But by the 50s and 60s, other printing technologies that took over, postcards that were sort of shinier and cheaper to produce had kind of took over the market. Teich didn't want to compromise on its quality and started to lose sort of market share through the 50s and 60s. And like I said, went out of business by the 1970s. Went out of business of producing postcards, at least by the 1970s. So we have pretty much all the Teich postcards, as I mentioned. What else do we have? One of the most interesting things about this collection is that it's not only the postcards, but the material that went into creating the postcards. So the Newberry is one of the best places in the world to study the process of how a postcard came to be in the 20th century through the company's production files. So showing you one example of a production file here, a sort of excessive example. The company generally worked from black and white photos to start because that's often what their photographers in the field had. Color film was not really common at the time. I mean, when they started, it didn't even exist as a consumer product, and remained uncommon through the height of the period of their success. So they worked from black and white photos and then had to do a lot of work to convert those black and white photos into color images. Excuse me. So you're seeing here an example of a pretty common image of a diner, the interior of a diner, that wanted to have a postcard showing its business. So what the art department did in conjunction with the photographer was take this image and mark it up heavily with what the colors of everything in that image should be, as well as the sort of textures that they would have, and marking it all out here. Some of the production files even include things like fabric swatches, like a hotel lobby, for instance, might want the look and feel of the fabric to be correct for the image of their lobby. So they would actually enclose a swatch of the fabric of the carpet, for instance. So they would do all of that work to make this conversion. I want to show one example of this process, more or less from start to finish. Well, finish to start to finish. So here's a finished postcard, another kind of common postcard type. It's just showing, it's showing this resort in Branson, Missouri. And it's a happy image of cabins and a large swimming pool with people swimming in it and a flagpole in front of it. Very nice kind of summery scene. How a postcard like this starts is with an order from the client. And the client here is saying basically, make this photograph that we're enclosing a summer scene with bathers in the pool, along with other details about what they're going to produce. This is the image that they have to work from. This is obviously not a summer scene with bathers in the pool. This is a scene of that pool, probably in the winter, maybe fall, with nobody in it and looking kind of bleak and desolate. So the art department basically had to work around that to create the image that the client wants. The client wants the image to be happy and cheerful, but they need to get that image made not at a time when the photograph is taken. So they're enclosing the photograph they have. What the art department does is take that image and basically draw on it. So in this case, they've added images of people in the pool. They've shortened the flagpole to make it less sort of invasive on the image, and then sort of colored it in to make it match what the client wanted to see. So postcards are often thought of as a kind of objective reality, that they're showing the real thing of life in one way or another. And in many cases, that's true. But in an awful lot of cases, the postcard producer has touched up the image in one way or another. This is a probably pretty obvious example once you know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, you might very well be fooled into thinking this is just a photograph of people in a pool. But in often cases, they're a combination of a photograph taken from life and work by artists to make the image match what the client wants consumers to see. So that's one example of their work there. Another thing that we have at the Newberry is the Teich Company's Geographic Index. So as I mentioned, all the company's postcards that they produce start with an order. They don't produce a postcard unless they either know that it's going to sell to somebody, or if they have somebody who said, yes, we're committing to buying this postcard. So they kept an index by geography, by state generally in the US, and then by the town within the state, of everybody ordering the postcards, when they ordered them and how many they were ordering. And this is also very valuable for learning the history of how the company operated and how generally the postcard industry worked in the first half of the 20th century. You're seeing here one image of thousands of pages from their geographic index. This one, I think, is from Rochester, New York, where they're recording all the information. The numbers in the sort of column here next to the title of the postcard or the subject of the postcard are how many postcards the client is ordering. The M is not millions, it's thousands. So generally it's 6,000, 12,500 was a common order, 25,000 was a common order. So they would have to order essentially that many. I think 6,000 was often the minimum. And they're recording who's ordering it, typically a business in the town. Drugstores were one of the most common that ordered, but lots of other businesses could order postcards as well, and did order postcards as well as clubs and other sort of social organizations ordered postcards also. So very interesting for learning the history of postcards as well. And we've actually made these available online. The Geographic Index is digitized. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We often get the question of what the heck we do with all the postcards, or have done with all the postcards. Well, we're very lucky in that they came to us basically already stored in these lovely cabinets that the Lake County Discovery Museum had purchased for the postcards. They're kept in postcard cabinets by and large. And you're seeing one of basically 27 cabinets like this that store mostly the Curt Teich Company's postcards. As I mentioned, there's something like 2 million items in the collection. 2.5 million is what we got. It's shrunk a little bit because there was a lot of duplicates, but Curt Teich Company kept multiple examples of all their postcards. That's why there's more items than unique images, but this is essentially how they're kept. They're kept in the order that the Teich Company produced them in. And they also kept albums. They kept a postcard album of one example of each postcard they produced. So there's over 2,000 large albums as well. The cabinets and albums that we got went straight into our Stacks building when we acquired the collection in 2016. Other material went into another storage area and was worked on to make it ready to go in. We do have other collections besides the Teich Company collection as well. As I said, it's one of the largest postcard collections in the world. So it's attracted individual postcard collectors as well as collections that have been built by clubs or other organizations, as well as other postcard companies' collections of their own work. And all of those examples of all of those kinds of collections are also at the Newberry. One other type of postcard that I really love are what are known as real photo postcards. Postcards were one of the first ways you could actually, take a picture yourself with your own camera, and you could send away to have it developed on a postcard. And then send it to a friend. You could make just one, you could make dozens of them if you wanted. So these are often very rare, and they often document a lot of sort of social history that's not otherwise documented. We have a collection called the Brian Bossier collection after the collector who was from Louisiana. And he has a great collection of real photo postcards. This is one of a natural disaster in Omaha, Nebraska, a tornado in Omaha, Nebraska, captured on camera and then sold as a postcard. You would want to send a postcard if you lived through this tornado to your friends and family saying, look what passed through here. So that's an interesting kind of postcard we have. Another example from that collection, it includes a lot of great imagery related to early aviation. This one, an example of an early aviator in an airplane in 1911 for a 4th of July celebration in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So lots of wonderful imagery there. The Bossier collection also includes an example of one of the sort of more fabled postcards, the Titanic postcard, or one of the Titanic postcards. There are multiple sold for the sort of maiden voyage of the Titanic. I don't have an image of that, I'm sorry, but get in touch with me if you want to see it, and I'll be happy to send it to you. We have another collection of a publisher of postcards, the Detroit Publishing Company. And my dirty little secret is that I actually like the Detroit Publishing Company postcards more than the Curt Teich Company postcards. I love the imagery of them, and their printing techniques were really spectacular. They use this sort of chromolithographic technique to produce these really beautiful color images that were more expensive and much more time consuming to produce than the process that the Teich Company pioneered, but they're incredibly beautiful. This one, an early 20th century image from Poughkeepsie, New York, of the main street there, just showing the different kind of colors that they could develop into a postcard. Detroit Publishing Company also had great coverage for the southwestern U.S. and the American Indian peoples of the southwestern U.S. Here, a Pueblo person featured on a postcard. Another Chicago-based publisher was the V.O. Hammon Company. And we have a very nearly comprehensive postcard collection for their postcards. They were a much smaller scale postcard publisher than, say, the Teich Company, but also produced some really high quality imagery, particularly for the Midwest and especially for Chicago. Here you can see a group of children in Chicago sort of huddling around the ice cream man as he comes around. And it's a really wonderful image from the first decade of the 20th century. So that's a wonderful collection for Chicago history and Chicago imagery in particular. Internationally, we have a wonderful collection of postcards produced by a company called Raphael Tuck and Sons, who specialized in sort of art postcards. They made postcards called oilettes, like miniature oil paintings, and they were meant to look like miniature oil paintings. And some of them didn't do a great job of letting you see the texture, but on postcards like this, they actually have a texture like an oil painting. They were made to have that look of an oil painting's texture. Leonard Lauder, a very well-known postcard collector, donated his collection of the Tuck and Sons postcards to the collection. And it's a wonderful collection for thinking about art and how art gets depicted on postcards and democratizing art forms through postcards, which were much more expensive, obviously, than a painting would be, and much more widely distributed than a painting would be. So that's another wonderful collection that we have, and that we have made digitally available in full. All of those postcards are digitized. Another publisher's collection is the Dexter Press collection. Dexter Press was one of the later postcard companies who really took over from the Teich Company as it was winding down and was more popular in the second half of the 20th century. So we have postcards of the Dexter Press, but we also have some of their production files. So you're seeing here an example of one production file showing a sort of black and white transparency and the original artwork up on top. This is a sort of original painting leading to a color transparency, and then a finished postcard down here. Another collection where you can see the process of the postcards being made. One of my other favorite collections is James Powell's collection of Route 66 postcards. So he collected postcards of all the sites that he could along Route 66, when Route 66 was sort of the main conduit across the United States, the main street of America, as it says here. So lots of great images of roadside diners and motels and roadside attractions that people would stop at along Route 66 in the first half of the 20th century through into the 1960s. You're seeing here a postcard sort of showing the route with one of the common things that people would do, which is write a postcard saying, here's where we are on Route 66, sending you a postcard from it. It's a wonderful, wonderful collection. We've got a donor named John Monroe who has donated a number of wonderful collections to us. He has collected postcards about postcards, and one of my favorite examples is here of a attraction in Hot Springs, Arkansas, called the Clucking Clerk. This apparently was real. He was a chicken rooster who you would drop 10 cents in the slot, and he would sort of peck a button that would dispense a postcard for you. Sort of funny example of postcard distribution there, and lots of other wonderful examples of postcards being sold on postcards and other kinds of things. But the newest collection that we have actually is John Monroe's collection of sports postcards. And since it's baseball season and we are in Chicago, here's one of my favorites from that collection, which is one of a series of 3 postcards celebrating the Chicago Cubs when they were the best team in the universe in the early 1900s. So this is a postcard, one of 3 postcards celebrating the most sort of celebrated double play combos in baseball history. Tinker to Evers to Chance, the shortstop, second baseman, and first baseman for the Cubs back then. This is the card for Frank Chance, showing a little cubby bear, a teddy bear, in the field. What I love about this postcard is that it's actually a bit of baseball history too, in that the back of the postcard was sent by a baseball fan named Ben to a friend of his named Andy in Bishop Hill. And he's writing on the day of a World Series game between the Cubs and the Tigers in 1907. And he writes, the postcard you can see is postmarked 8 p.m. It was still when you had multiple postal runs each day. So he writes after the game, today's score should have been about 6-1 in place of 3-1 if the Cubs had tended to biz. They are a whole lot too fast for the Tigers. Tigers hit well, but are showed up on the bases. So Ben is very confident the Cubs are going to continue to win World Series for a very long time, not knowing that there would be quite a drought in the Cubs' success coming later in the century. Equal time, of course, we had a Cubs postcard, so there are also White Sox postcards in the collection. A couple of early White Sox postcards here from when the White Sox were also on top of the world, also in the first decade of the 20th century. The one in the upper left is actually a postcard made of leather. And there are a number of examples of postcards like this that are made of different media. You could actually send them through the mail, still can actually. There are still novelty postcards like this that can occasionally be found. But this one's made of leather and celebrating the world champion White Sox of the time. In the lower right is a 1907 postcard celebrating the White Sox as actual socks hanging on a clothesline with Charles Comiskey in the lower left. So a couple of good White Sox postcards as well. Another great collection is the collection of a man named John High, who collected Art Deco and Art Nouveau postcards, including some of the most famous ones from postcard history. Alphonse Mucha, who's a pretty famous Art Nouveau artist, fine artist who created paintings as well as prints and other things, also did designs for postcards. One of the most famous of which is on the left, the Waverly Cycles postcard advertising Waverly bicycles. He did the design for, and it's become a sort of famous collector's item for postcard collectors. So example of that. We have a great postcard collection for amusement parks, of postcards from amusement parks around the country in the 20th century, the Rich Juvenile collection. These are from upstate New York, Rensselaer Park in Troy, New York, and I think a couple of other amusement parks in upstate New York as well. There's also postcards that celebrate the medium for its correspondence capabilities as well. We have postcards created by a poet named David Thompson, who has a habit of sending out postcards to a variety of correspondents around the country, accompanied by his own original photographs. And often there are interesting stories that sort of overlap between his sort of poetic images and his poetic messages on the back. The collection we have is mostly sent to a fellow poet named Kaveh Akbar, and Thompson sort of develops this narrative, this story through the postcards. It's like a novel in postcard form almost. So another really wonderful example of a different kind of use of postcards in that collection. Close out here with just a couple minutes on how you can use this collection. We do not have the collection digitized in its entirety. That will still take us quite some time, but we do have tens of thousands of images of postcards available online. So the Curt Teich Postcard Archives digital collection is the main place where you can find a lot of these. Like I mentioned, there's over 500,000 unique images, and we have something like 50,000 images on this website. So it's around 10%, you know, it's not a huge amount of them, but there are records for most of the postcards on this website. There's another website on the internet, or another portion of the Internet Archive, where we've also made postcards available. And you can see there's, I think it's actually more than this now. I think it's more than 30,000 that are available there. But particularly the Raphael Tuck and Sons postcards are available through this website as well. And this is just an image of sort of the work that goes into creating the metadata, the image of the information about the image of the postcards that goes into making those digital images available. A couple of other fun things. We have a postcard sender that we've made available on our website, where you can sort of randomly generate an image of a postcard, typically related to a holiday that's coming up or the season that we're in. And you can send that digital image to a friend of yours as a sort of virtual postcard. So that's a sort of fun thing to do if you want. And last but not least, the records that I've been mentioning, the Curt Teich Company's records have an inventory online. So you can request, you know, production files for a particular postcard, or request postcards themselves, or whatever else you might want through the inventory for those records. And you can certainly always get in touch with our reference staff if you have questions about how to do that. There's a research guide that's kind of a one-stop shop for all of this information and links to all these places that I've been sharing. And that link is on your screen here. You can always Google it as well, and it will pop up very near the top of the list, if not at the very top of the list. So don't feel like you have to scramble and write it down very quickly here, but you can always get in touch and we'll be happy to send it to you as well. So I think I'll stop there so we have a little time for questions, but thank you all so much for coming. I hope this was interesting and piqued your interest, and remember, you're welcome to visit the library and take a look at this collection yourself. So thanks very much.
Excellent presentation, Will. Very, very interesting. I'm going to ask everyone now, if you have any questions, to type them into the question and answer chat.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question from Barbara about whether there are postcards of Lincoln Park or Brookfield Zoo. There definitely are of both. Chicago, as the home of one of the largest postcard producers, the Curt Teich Company, was very well represented in postcards. And we have digitized most of the postcards of Chicago that we have, not all, but most. So there are hundreds of views of Lincoln Park, and there are definitely images of Brookfield Zoo as well. They're both pretty well represented in the postcards and in the digital databases that I mentioned before. Yep. See another question that came in about the library accepting, does the library accept donations of old postcards and how does one do that? A very good question. The answer is yes, with some sort of asterisks. So we do accept donations. We do have a collection development policy for postcards posted on our website, and I'm happy to send a link to that if it's hard to find. But we're pretty particular because we have so many already. So we don't generally accept donations of sort of miscellaneous postcards or a family's collection of postcards that doesn't have like a focus of one kind or another, because we're so likely to have many of the postcards that are represented there already. But if there's a collection that has a particular interesting topical focus or geographic focus that we're not, that isn't well represented in our collection already, certainly we will consider that. The best way to get in touch with us is really just to send us an email, send me an email. My email is just my last name and first initial, Hansen W, HANSENW @newberry.org, NEWBERRY.org. And I'll be happy to talk with you about what you have. You can also just give me a phone call. We have a staff directory on our website. I'm pretty easy to find there. But yeah, just starting with a conversation about what you have is a good first step. But like I said, we're pretty choosy because we have so many already. Although we do always appreciate people thinking of us. Thanks for the question. I see a question about the dollar value of the various types of postcards, of the linen style versus the real photo postcards. Another very good question and something that changes over time. So there have been periods when the real photo postcards that I mentioned were not very popular, did not sell for very much money. People were more interested in the sort of printed postcards that weren't real photographs. That has completely flipped over the last 20 to 30 years. Real photo postcards are now among the highest dollar value postcards often. They're often harder to find a particular example, and they include some very unusual kinds of imagery. So they are often among the highest dollar value postcards. That being said, there are some types of printed postcards that are still very high value, particularly those by particular artists. I mentioned Alphonse Mucha in the presentation. There are a number of other artists who worked in the postcard form and became very well known for their imagery that postcard collectors really covet and can command some high dollar values as well. Curt Teich, the linen postcards that the Curt Teich company produced and then that other companies kind of imitated that style, are not generally as high a dollar value anymore. They often sell for $0.25 to $1, depending on what the subject is and how common the postcard is. But they were produced in very large numbers in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases. So they're often easier to find, and therefore the dollar value is less. But I would encourage you to speak to a postcard seller, a postcard. Somebody in the postcard business of selling used postcards who would be more of an expert in this than I would. But that's my general impression of the sort of field right now. See a question here from Dale about is the whole postcard collection now in the public domain? Another good question. The answer is no. There are still postcards that are within copyright. The Curt Teich company collection is pretty exceptional in that much of it is in the public domain, at least that is our understanding. You can find information about this in that research guide that I linked to in the last slide. But essentially, our understanding is that most of the Teich postcards produced before 1966 are in the public domain. Pretty much all postcards produced prior to 1923, 1924 are in the public domain as well. But with some postcard companies, they're still operational, or the rights to those postcards have been sold to other companies, subsequent companies. So some of them are in copyright and some of them aren't. So most of the images that you'll find on our website are in the public domain, or it's our understanding they're in the public domain, and they're available for use. The only real exception is if there's like a trademark shown on them, if there's a company's like a sign of a company shown in them, or if they have a photographer's own copyright mark on them. But by and large, most of them are in the public domain, but there are portions of the collection that are still within copyright. Copyright's complicated, but you can always get in touch with us if you have questions about that. Question from Don about the aviation Keep Them Flying series from World War II online. I don't think we have those postcards online. I might not be right about the series that I'm thinking of. I am actually thinking of a postcards or a poster series of Keep Them Flying posters. They probably were produced as postcards as well. I don't think we've made them available online, although it's certainly possible another institution has. But a good question. Another question about whether we did the Newberry sell duplicates from the Curt Teich collection. So there were duplicates sold from the collection prior to it coming to the Newberry. I know that the Lake County Discovery Museum did have sales of some of the duplicates of the collection from the collection probably 20 or so years ago now. So that was done prior to them coming. We have sold smaller batches of duplicates, but not generally of Curt Teich postcards since it came to the library. Doesn't mean it won't happen in the future, but we haven't had a big sale or anything of duplicates yet.
Well, I think I can answer this next one from Rosemarie. Rosemarie is asking, will the presentation be on the library website to be viewed again? Yes, this presentation is being recorded and it will be on the library's YouTube channel this Saturday.
I think we got to all of them, unless there are any other questions.
Great. Any other questions? Well, I think that's it. I think this is a good place to end the presentation and the program. Thank you very much, Will. This was excellent. I know I'll be visiting the Newberry website very soon and searching and browsing through the database of postcards. So thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you all.
Take care. Have a good evening.